He was crying alone on the swing, and everyone walked past him like he wasn't real. The sound didn't belong in the fog. It was too small, too human, too heartbroken for a place that had forgotten what tenderness felt like. Mara Hensley stopped mid-step, the heel of her boot sinking into frost, her breath rising in thin ghosts against the November dawn. She should have kept walking. She was dead on her feet after a double shift at the diner, her uniform stiff with coffee stains and grease. But something in that quiet sob pulled at her, the same way a loose thread on a sweater begged to be tugged. She turned toward the swings. The park was almost invisible in the fog, a gray blur of trees and half-frozen puddles, the kind of place that made people cross the street after sunset. But he was there. A boy, no older than 6, sitting perfectly still except for the trembling of his shoulders. His feet were bare. His hands gripped the chain of the swing so tight, the knuckles looked blue. Mara hesitated at the gate. Her first thought was that he was lost. Her second, that she didn't have time for this. The bus to her apartment would leave in 10 minutes, and if she missed it, she'd have to walk all the way home through the industrial district. She hated that this calculation even entered her mind, hated how poverty taught her to measure compassion in minutes. But the boy's shoulders shook again, and that sound, God, that sound, cut straight through her exhaustion. She stepped into the park. The fog swallowed her after 3 steps. The swing creaked once, and the crying stopped. "Hey," she called softly. "You okay, sweetheart?" No answer. Just the faint hiss of wind moving through skeletal branches. Mara moved closer until she could see his face. He was beautiful in that unsettling way only broken things can be. Pale as porcelain, eyes wide and glassy like a doll's, his lips almost blue. There was something off about him, something that made her skin crawl even as pity rose in her chest. "Hey," she said again, kneeling in front of him. "You'll freeze out here. Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer. He just looked at her, and she realized his pupils were too large, swallowing almost all of the color. "Okay," she whispered. "You're scared. That's fine." She took off her scarf, a frayed wool thing her mother had knitted years ago, and wrapped it around his shoulders. When her fingers brushed his skin, she gasped. It was like touching stone. Not cold from the air, but cold from within. No pulse, no warmth, just a chill that felt ancient. For a moment, instinct screamed at her to run. But then his small hands tightened on the scarf, clutching it as though it were the only thing tethering him to life. "Thank you," he murmured. The voice was thin, trembling, like wind slipping through cracks in old glass. Mara forced a smile. "You're welcome. But you shouldn't be out here. Where's your home?" The boy lowered his gaze. He said not to move. He said he'd come back when the sun's gone. The way he said it made something in her chest tighten. "Who did?" she asked, but the boy only shook his head. His fingers toyed with a silver locket hanging from his neck. Oval, engraved with a crown wrapped in wings. As she looked closer, she realized it was faintly glowing, like moonlight trapped beneath the metal. "What's that?" she asked softly. "It's his," the boy said. "He told me never to lose it." When she reached out to steady it, the air around them seemed to hum. A pulse of warmth surged through her fingertips, startlingly alive, and for the first time, the boy's eyes met hers fully. They were gray, not the gray of storm clouds or stone, but of ashes that still hid embers underneath. "Mara." The whisper came from behind her. She froze. No one had spoken her name. Not here. Not now. She turned, but the park was empty. The fog curled thicker, muting the sound of traffic, swallowing the world in silence. She grabbed the boy's hand. "Come on," she said. "We're getting out of here." His fingers were icy, small enough to fit entirely inside her palm. They'd barely taken 3 steps before the air shifted. The swing behind them creaked once, twice, then stopped. Everything went still. A low, distant sound rolled across the park, too deep to be wind, too alive to be thunder. The streetlights flickered. Somewhere far off, a dog began to howl. The boy's grip on her hand tightened painfully. "He's coming," he whispered. Mara tried to convince herself this was nothing, that she was overtired, hallucinating from no sleep and too much caffeine. But when she looked down, the boy's locket was pulsing faster, each beat casting a faint light against his throat, like a heartbeat outside his skin. "Who's coming?" she asked, her voice breaking. The boy shook his head. "My father." Something in the fog moved, tall, silent, the shape of a man but wrong, too still, too graceful, like a statue deciding to walk. Mara's breath caught. She couldn't see his face, only the faint red glint of eyes watching them through the mist. The boy whimpered and buried his face against her coat. Every instinct she had screamed to run, but she stood her ground. "Stay behind me," she whispered. The figure took a step forward, the sound of boots against frost barely audible. The fog parted for him as though afraid to touch. Then, nothing. Just silence and the sharp taste of iron in the air. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Only the swing moved, creaking softly in the wind. She looked down. The boy was staring up at her, tears freezing on his lashes. "You shouldn't have touched me," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because now he'll come for you, too." Mara didn't know it yet, but by wrapping her scarf around that strange, silent child, she had been marked. And the man in the mist, the one with the eyes like burning coals, had already found her scent on the air. The fog that morning refused to lift. It clung to the trees and telephone wires like cobwebs, swallowing the sunlight before it ever reached the ground. By the time Mara stepped into the diner with the boy bundled in her coat, her nerves were stretched thin as glass. The world outside felt wrong, too still, too quiet, as if something enormous was holding its breath. Inside, everything smelled of burnt coffee and dish soap, the scent of survival. The neon sign buzzed faintly over the window, casting a sickly glow across the cracked linoleum floor. The boy hadn't said another word since they'd left the park. He sat in the corner booth near the window, knees drawn to his chest, eyes fixed on the steam rising from a cup of cocoa she'd made him. Every so often he'd glance at the door, flinching when a car passed outside. Mara tried to keep herself busy, wiping the counter, checking the coffee machine, pretending this was any other morning, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the cold that made her uneasy. It was the silence, the sense that they weren't alone, that something unseen was watching through the fogged-up glass. She told herself it was nonsense. Monsters didn't exist, but the boy's icy skin and glowing locket didn't fit in any world she understood. Maybe he'd escaped from some strange cult or underground medical experiment, something horrific but explainable. She just needed to get through the morning, then take him to the sheriff's office, and maybe someone would know what to do. The bell above the door jingled, a delicate sound that cut through the stillness. Mara looked up automatically, expecting one of the regulars. Truckers, maybe a mailman. But the man who stepped through the door was nothing like anyone she'd ever seen. He didn't just walk in. The air seemed to fold around him, the light dimming as though reluctant to touch his form. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his long black coat dripped rainwater onto the floor, though no rain had fallen since dawn. His hair, dark as coal, framed a face both beautiful and terrible. Sharp lines, high cheekbones, and eyes that glowed faintly red beneath the shadow of his hood. Mara's first thought was that he looked like he'd stepped out of some fever dream, a painting come to life. Too elegant, too still, too wrong. Her second thought was that the air suddenly smelled of iron and cold stone, like the inside of a crypt. The stranger's gaze swept over the diner, and every instinct in her body screamed to hide the boy. Without thinking, she moved between the stranger and the booth, her pulse hammering. "We're not open yet," she said, though the words came out quieter than she meant. The man's voice was low, resonant, carrying the weight of ages and the authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "You are Mara Hensley." It wasn't a question. The way he said her name made her blood run cold. She nodded slowly, unwilling to lie but too afraid to speak. He stepped closer, each movement graceful but deliberate, like a predator closing in. "You were in the park this morning," he continued. "You found a child." Mara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "If you're from the police, you can—" "I am not," he interrupted, and his eyes flared brighter, a glint of crimson slicing through the fog outside the windows. "Where is he?" For a moment she didn't breathe. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. "You need to leave," she said, voice trembling but steady enough to pass for courage. "I don't know who you are, but you're scaring me." The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "You should be afraid," he said quietly. "You have something that belongs to me." The boy's cup clattered against the table. The stranger's gaze snapped toward the sound, and in that instant, Mara saw something shift behind his expression. Not anger, not surprise, but raw, desperate recognition. He moved so quickly she barely saw it, crossing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. Instinct took over. She stepped in front of the booth, blocking his path. "Don't touch him," she said. Her voice cracked, but her stance didn't falter. The man stopped a breath away from her. His presence filled the room like a storm, pulling the warmth from the air. "You don't understand," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "He's my son." The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked back at the boy, who had shrunk against the window, shaking his head, eyes wide with terror. "That's not true," he whispered, clutching the locket. "You're not my father anymore." Something broke across the man's face, grief so deep it seemed to hollow him out from within. He reached toward the child, hand trembling, and Mara saw then that his fingers weren't quite human. The nails were too long, the veins beneath the pale skin too dark. When he touched the locket's chain, it hissed faintly, smoke curling where his flesh met silver. He pulled back, pain flickering through his eyes. "Cassian," he murmured, his voice shaking. "Please." Mara looked between them, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The boy, Cassian, was crying now, silent sobs that shook his small frame. "He hurt Mama," he whispered. "He said she'd never leave." The man flinched as though struck. "That is not true," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "She was taken from us. You don't remember." Mara had no idea what any of this meant. All she knew was that the boy didn't want to go with him. "You need to leave," she repeated, forcing strength into the words. "You're scaring him." The man's gaze shifted to her again, and for a moment, she felt as if he could see straight through her skin, through her heartbeat, through the fragile threads of her thoughts. "You don't know what you're doing," he said softly. "That locket marks him as royal blood. If he stays with you, others will come. They will kill you both to reach him." Royal blood. The words made no sense, yet something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the ancient sorrow, made her believe he wasn't lying. Mara took a step back, keeping herself between them. "Then let them try," she said quietly. "I'm not letting you take him." The man's expression changed, no longer anger or desperation, but something closer to awe. "You would defy me for a child you do not know?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He's scared." "That's enough." For a heartbeat, silence filled the diner. Then, from outside, something heavy struck the ground, a sound like wings folding through the fog. The man's head snapped toward the window, his eyes narrowing. "They've found us," he muttered. The lights flickered violently, every bulb in the diner humming with electricity, before bursting in a shower of sparks. Cassian screamed, and Mara dropped to her knees, covering him as glass rained down. When she looked up again, the man was standing over them, his hand raised. The air shimmered around his fingers, twisting like heat waves. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice carrying a power that pressed against her chest. The shattered glass on the floor lifted, suspended in the air, as if caught in invisible water. Each shard glowed faintly red before dissolving into mist. The man looked down at her, his face unreadable. "You see now what hunts in the daylight," he said. "I am not your enemy." Mara's voice was barely a whisper. "Then what are you?" He hesitated, as though deciding how much truth she could bear. "A father," he said finally. "A king. And a monster, when I must be." Through the fogged glass, Mara saw movement, figures cloaked in shadow circling the parking lot, their eyes glinting faintly gold. The man turned toward them, his jaw tightening. They should not have found him so soon. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw fear in his expression, not for himself, but for the boy. "Take him," he said suddenly, thrusting Cassian into her arms. "Go through the back door. Do not stop, no matter what you hear." She stared at him, stunned. "What about you?" He smiled, a small, tragic thing that barely reached his eyes. "I will hold them. You have his trust. That may be the only thing that saves him now." Before she could protest, he turned toward the door, the air around him pulsing with strange energy. The fog outside boiled and twisted as he stepped through it, the light from the diner stretching and warping around his silhouette. The door slammed behind him, and for a heartbeat everything went silent, until the night exploded with sound, the clash of steel, the hiss of something burning, and a roar that wasn't quite human. Mara clutched Cassian tighter, his heartbeat, or whatever pulsed within him, thudding wildly against her chest. "Who are they?" she whispered, running toward the back of the diner. The boy's voice trembled. "Hunters," he said. "They smell bloodlines." Behind them, the ground shook. Mara didn't look back. She pushed through the back door into the alley, the fog curling like smoke around her legs. Somewhere above, the neon sign sputtered, flickered once, and died, plunging the diner into darkness. She didn't know who the man was, or what kind of creature could tear the sky open with a single roar. But she knew one thing, with absolute certainty. The boy wasn't lying when he said his father would come for her, and whatever war had begun in that park at dawn, she was already standing in its center. The road out of Hollow Pines was a thin vein of asphalt threading through the forest, swallowed at every turn by mist and trees that leaned too close, their branches heavy with frost. Mara drove with both hands gripping the wheel, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. The boy sat beside her, wrapped in her old coat, eyes fixed on the window, where the fog crawled like smoke. Every few miles, she glanced at him just to make sure he was still breathing. He didn't speak, didn't move, only clutched the silver locket against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Behind them, the horizon burned with the faint light of the town, weak, artificial, and already fading into distance. She had left everything she owned behind: her bag, her wallet, her phone. The moment the man had stepped through that diner door, her old life had cracked like glass, and all that remained now was the hum of the engine and the child beside her, who seemed carved from the same silence that haunted the woods. She didn't know how long they drove. Time lost its shape on roads like this. The forest thickened, swallowing the moonlight. The farther they went, the colder it became, until frost began to leave the inside of the windshield. The boy finally stirred. "You shouldn't have helped me," he said softly, not looking at her. "They'll come again." His voice carried no emotion, just a quiet resignation that made her heart ache. "Who will?" she asked. "The ones that smell the crown," he murmured. "They can't stand that it still beats." She wanted to ask what that meant, but the look on his face stopped her. He wasn't a child speaking in riddles. He was remembering something too big for language. The gas gauge hovered just above empty when she saw it. An old roadside chapel half hidden by the trees, its steeple broken, windows boarded over. The sign by the entrance had rusted so badly that only 2 words remained legible: Sanctuary Keep. She pulled over, killed the headlights, and sat in the silence that followed, the ticking of the cooling engine loud as a heartbeat. "We'll stay here until morning," she said. "Then I'll figure out what to do." The boy nodded without argument, though his eyes lingered on the tree line. When she reached for the door handle, his small hand shot out, gripping her sleeve. "Don't leave me," he whispered, and something in that plea, so fragile, so full of a fear he couldn't name, made her promise before she even thought about it. Inside, the chapel smelled of damp wood and dust. Long-forgotten hymns clung to the air like echoes. The pews were rotted, the altar covered in a film of ash. Someone had painted a circle of symbols on the floor near the pulpit, old runes, half faded, but not erased. The moment they stepped inside, the boy relaxed, shoulders unclenching for the first time since the diner. Mara felt it too, a stillness that wasn't peace but protection. A hush that pressed against the windows from the outside. Whatever this place was, it kept something out. She set the boy on one of the pews and found a box of candles in a cabinet near the altar. Their light was faint but steady, throwing long shadows across the ruined walls. "We'll be safe here for the night," she said, more to convince herself than him. The boy traced a finger over the runes on the floor. "These are old," he murmured. "Older than your prayers." His words sent a chill through her, but before she could ask what he meant, the wooden doors groaned open behind them. He was standing in the doorway, the man from the diner, the vampire, the king, whatever he was. The fog clung to him like a living thing, tendrils curling around his boots, and his eyes burned brighter than before. Mara's breath caught, her heart stumbling into panic. "Stay back," she said, though she had nothing to defend herself with but a broken candle holder. The man raised a hand, palm open. "You're safe," he said quietly. "If I meant you harm, you'd already be dead." It wasn't a threat, just a fact, delivered with the weary certainty of someone older than the idea of mercy itself. The boy's eyes widened. "Father," he whispered, and the man's expression changed, something between relief and despair. He stepped closer, and Mara saw the exhaustion carved into his features, the faint tremor in his hand as he reached for his son. "Cassian," he said softly, voice cracking. "You can't run from me forever." The boy drew back, clutching the locket. "You lied," he said. "You said Mother would wake up." The man flinched as though struck. "I wanted to protect you," he said, "from the truth, from the ones who killed her." He turned to Mara, his gaze sharp, but not cruel. You have no idea what you've stumbled into, mortal. That child carries a bloodline entire kingdoms would kill to extinguish. Mara lowered the candle holder slowly, her fear warping into something sharper. Then start explaining, she said. Because so far, all I know is that people with glowing eyes keep trying to kill us. The vampire studied her, as if weighing whether she deserved the truth. Finally, he sighed. My name is Armand Vael, he said. King of the Night Court. His mother, my queen, was murdered 3 nights ago by those who believed our reign had lasted too long. Cassian was the last piece of her left in this world. They tried to take him, to use him as leverage. But he escaped. You found him before they did. He looked at the boy, something like reverence flickering in his gaze. You saved him, though you should have run. Mara's mind reeled. None of it made sense. The titles, the language, the quiet grief in his tone. But there was no lie in his eyes. If what you're saying is true, she said slowly, then why does he act like you're the monster? Armand's face hardened. Because I am one. The admission fell like a stone between them. I have done what I must to protect our kind. I've slaughtered. I've ruled through fear, and I failed to save her. He sees only the blood, not the reason. The boy's voice trembled from the pew. Mother said, love doesn't need a reason. Armand closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. And that, he said quietly, is why she was the light of this cursed kingdom. Mara looked from father to son and back again, the tension between them tangible, almost physical. What happens now? She asked. You can't just hide here forever. Those things you fought, they were not things, Armand interrupted. They were courtiers, nobles once loyal to my throne. Now they serve a new master who believes a human heart can never be pure enough to rule beside ours. He looked around the chapel, studying the runes. You chose your refuge well. This place was built by those who remembered the old covenants, when humans and vampires still walked the same roads. The boy slid from the pew and crossed to Mara's side, his small hand finding hers. I don't want to go with him, he whispered. He makes the air hurt. She squeezed his fingers, her mind spinning. You said others would come, she told Armand. If they find us here, can you stop them? The vampire's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. I can try. But your protection comes at a price. Mara stiffened. What kind of price? Armand's gaze softened, almost sorrowful. The bond has already begun, he said. When you touched him, when you offered warmth without fear, you invoked an ancient seal, one forgotten even by my kind. The locket recognized it. It marked you as his keeper. Now his life and yours are bound. If he dies, you die with him. The words hit her like ice water. That's not possible. It is older than possibility, he replied. And irreversible. Mara sank onto a pew, dizzy. So what? You're saying I'm stuck in some kind of blood curse because I didn't walk away? I am saying, Armand said quietly, that you did what even immortals forget how to do. You showed compassion, and the world noticed. Outside, the fog began to stir again, whispering against the windows. Armand's head snapped toward the door. They've found the trail, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. We have to move. He turned to Cassian. Do not let go of her hand. The boy obeyed instantly, and Mara felt the locket pulse between them, a heartbeat that wasn't either of theirs, but something shared. Armand led them through a hidden door behind the altar, down a narrow stairway that spiraled into darkness. The walls were slick with moisture, the air colder with each step. "Where are we going?" Mara asked, her voice echoing softly. "To the catacombs," he replied. "The sanctuary's heart. It will hold them off long enough for me to decide whether I can trust you." When they emerged into the underground hall, Mara's breath caught. The chamber was enormous, carved entirely from black stone, the ceiling lost in shadow. Candles burned in iron holders along the walls, though no one had lit them. The light flickered faintly blue, illuminating old carvings, figures of humans and vampires standing side by side, hands joined over a shared flame. "This is where the first treaty was forged," Armand said, his voice echoing. "A promise of coexistence that both sides betrayed. But the magic remains. The sanctuary recognizes those who act without fear. That's why it let you in." He looked at her, eyes unreadable. "You may not understand it now, but you've become part of something larger than either of us." Mara shook her head, exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to help a child." Armand's expression softened. "That is precisely why the seal chose you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Cassian's power is dormant, but when it awakens, the world will either burn or be reborn. The choice, it seems, will depend on the mortal woman who found him in the fog." Mara wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was just a waitress with overdue bills and a broken car, but the words wouldn't come. The boy leaned against her side, his breathing slow and steady now, trusting. She looked down at his pale face and felt something shift in her chest, a fierce, inexplicable need to protect him, even from his own father if she had to. Above them, the ground trembled with the distant sound of wings. Armand turned toward the stairs, his eyes flaring red. "They're coming faster than I thought," he said. "If I fall, you run. Don't look back." Mara rose to her feet, gripping the boy's hand tighter. "And if you don't fall?" she asked. Armand smiled, a real smile this time, fleeting but almost human. "Then maybe," he said, "the night will remember what mercy feels like." The candles guttered as the first echoing shriek filled the tunnel, the sound of ancient hatred made flesh. And in that flickering blue light, surrounded by ruins of a forgotten peace, Mara understood that her life had already become something myth would envy. The sanctuary's catacombs became their refuge for the next 2 days, a space outside of time where the light from the candles never fully died, and the air carried the faint sweetness of dust and stone. Mara had stopped asking how the candles burned without melting, and why the air, despite its chill, felt like the breath of something alive. She accepted the impossible now, with the weary pragmatism of someone who had run out of ordinary explanations. Armand had not left the upper level since the first night, standing sentinel beneath the chapel's cracked altar, while Cassian slept curled against Mara's side on a bed made from old vestments. When he did wake, he would watch the dripping water from the ceiling with quiet fascination, as if each drop was some secret he half remembered. Mara's body hurt from the hard stone floor, her throat raw from lack of sleep, but she felt safer in those dark tunnels than she ever had in her own apartment. Safety, she realized, was not the absence of danger. It was the presence of someone willing to stand between you and it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Armand descended the staircase, his footsteps echoing softly. His usual stillness was gone, replaced by the sharp tension of a man who had seen too much movement beyond the safety of the runes. "The council knows," he said simply, and his voice carried an exhaustion that made Mara's chest tighten. "The High Bloods have convened in the Court of Ash. They will send their enforcers. The sanctuary's protection won't last long once they sense mortal blood in its walls." Mara was sitting by the altar, peeling an apple she had found in her bag, the last remnant of her old life. Then what are we supposed to do? Keep running until we drop? Armand studied her for a long moment before speaking. There is a place deeper still, he said. An antechamber built before the first schism between our kinds. If its wards still hold, it will grant us passage through the old network beneath the mountains. She frowned. And that's supposed to take us where? To the Vale, he said, and when he spoke the word, the air itself seemed to thrum. My mother's house, a place no council eyes can reach. It was there the first covenant was signed between mortal and immortal blood. If any hope of peace remains, it will be there. Cassian looked up from the rune circle where he had been tracing patterns with his fingertip. Mother said the Vale sleeps beneath silver trees, he said softly. Armand's gaze softened. She was right. You remember. The tenderness in his voice startled Mara. She had seen him fight with the calm cruelty of a predator, had felt the chill that came off his skin when he passed too close. But in that moment, when he looked at his son, the edges of the monster blurred into something almost human. It was fleeting, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, but real. They left that evening, moving through a hidden door concealed behind an old tapestry. The tunnel beyond sloped downward, carved into the mountain's heart, and though it stretched endlessly, no dust clung to their shoes, no echo returned from their steps. The walls pulsed faintly with veins of light, as if something ancient still breathed inside the stone. Mara carried a lantern, though she wasn't sure it was necessary. The air itself glowed dimly, like embers caught behind glass. At first they moved in silence. Cassian walked between them, his hand clutching Mara's fingers, the locket pressed against his heart. After an hour or a lifetime, Mara finally spoke. You said the sanctuary was built for both our kinds, she said quietly. What happened? Why did it end? Armand didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with centuries. Fear happened. Your kind saw what you didn't understand, and we, immortals, saw in your brief lives a beauty we couldn't own. We envied your warmth and despised our hunger. The covenant broke. The moment love between the two races produced blood that was neither one nor the other. They called it abomination. They burned villages to erase it. But love is stubborn. It hides in the smallest corners of the world until the world is forced to look again. Mara glanced at him, surprised by the rawness in his tone. You sound like you know that from experience. He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. I do. Cassian's mother was human. The words settled between them like a confession. Mara stopped walking. You mean, he's a half, Armand said. The first of his kind to survive the birth. His mother paid for it with her life. He paused, his gaze distant. When the council learned of her pregnancy, they declared her a heretic. I hid her as long as I could. But when Cassian was born, her heart failed. Or so I was told. Later, I learned it was no failure. It was murder disguised as mercy. Mara felt her stomach twist. And now they're after him. They are after the idea of him, Armand corrected. If he lives, their laws unravel. The bloodline of the Night Court cannot mix with mortal breath without undoing everything they built on fear. His existence threatens the order of eternity. For a moment they walked in silence again, the weight of his words pressing heavy. The tunnel widened, opening into a vast cavern where light filtered through from unseen cracks above, painting the stone with shades of blue and silver. It was beautiful and haunting, like stepping into the bones of a cathedral that had forgotten its gods. Cassian's small voice broke the stillness. Mother used to sing here. Armand froze. What did you say? She sang about stars that forgot how to shine, Cassian said, his eyes half closed. She said, "This is where the earth remembers the first light." Mara's lantern flickered, though no wind stirred. "He's remembering something," she whispered. Armand knelt in front of his son, his crimson eyes glowing faintly. "Cassian, listen to me. That song, do you remember the words?" The boy frowned in concentration. "Only the last line," he said. It said, "When blood remembers love, the night will fall asleep." Armand's breath caught. That was her prophecy, he murmured. She said it before she died. Mara felt goosebumps crawl up her arms. "What does it mean?" "It means," Armand said slowly, "that the curse binding our worlds might yet be undone, but only through love freely given, not demanded." He looked at Mara, his gaze unreadable. "When you touched him in the park, the mark responded. It may have recognized something neither of us understand yet." She shook her head, half in disbelief, half in fear. "I'm just a waitress, not some chosen savior." "Perhaps," he said softly. "But so was she, a mortal woman who made even immortals kneel." They reached the heart of the cavern, a circular dais carved with symbols that shimmered faintly beneath the boys. "Locket." Armand placed his hand over one of the sigils, and the air rippled like water. "It still lives," he said. "The passage remains." The ground shuddered, and from the shadows emerged faint figures, specters shaped from smoke and memory. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty sockets glowing with pale fire. Mara stumbled back, clutching Cassian. "What are they?" "Echoes," Armand said. "The last guardians of the Veil. They test the worth of those who enter." The specters surrounded them silently, their forms flickering. One reached toward Mara, and she felt the cold of centuries brush her skin. Her instinct screamed to fight, but before she could move, Cassian stepped forward. "She's with me," he said, his voice steady in a way it had never been before. The locket blazed with sudden light, silver spilling across the stone like molten moonlight. The spirits froze, then bowed their heads, dissolving into mist. Armand exhaled shakily. "The bond is sealed," he whispered. "He has chosen you." Mara's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, heart hammering. "What does that even mean?" Armand knelt beside her. "It means that his fate and mine are tied to yours now. You are his anchor, the bridge between mortal heart and immortal will. Through you, he will remember what he was born for." She looked down at Cassian, who was smiling faintly, exhaustion clouding his small features. "And what is that?" she asked. Armand met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw both terror and hope. "To end the hunger that divides our kind." Silence followed, deep and ancient, broken only by the slow rhythm of dripping water. Mara didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She had gone from pouring coffee in a roadside diner to standing in a cavern older than history, marked by prophecies she didn't understand, and bound to a child who might change the world. Yet, as she looked at him, sleeping now against her arm, she realized she didn't regret a single step. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of the unknown, but of losing something that had begun to matter more than her own life. When Armand spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "We have until the next moonrise before the Council's hunters reach these tunnels. If we can reach the Veil before then, The old laws will protect us. And if we don't? She asked. He looked toward the darkness ahead, where the light from the runes faded into black. Then the child's curse will awaken before its time, and the world will learn what happens when compassion bleeds into power. Mara followed his gaze, her pulse steady now, her decision made long before her mind could name it. Then we'd better start walking. And as they descended deeper into the mountain, guided by a light that pulsed from the boy's locket, Mara realized that this journey, the path toward whatever waited at the end of the veil, was no longer about survival. It was about faith, not in gods or kings, but in the fragile, stubborn bond between a human woman, a cursed child, and a creature who had forgotten how to hope. The passage narrowed until even Armand had to angle his shoulders to slip through, the black stone sweating a mineral sheen that made every surface treacherous. And as the tunnel descended, the air grew so cold, Mara's breath stopped rising in ghosts and began to fall around her as a faint glitter, as if the mountain were collecting what warmth she had left and salting it away like a miser hoarding coins. Yet the boy's locket continued its steady pulse, and each glow felt like a hand squeezing hers in the dark, reminding her that moving forward was not bravery, so much as obedience to a promise she had made to no one, but the child who trusted her without evidence. When the tunnel finally opened, it was into a gallery of pillars shaped by water and time, ribbed and fluted, an underground forest of stone, with a river sliding between the trunks like a ribbon of smoked glass. Across that river stretched an ancient bridge no wider than a pew, its balustrade carved with leaves and winged crowns half-eaten by centuries. Armand paused, listening with the stillness of a predator, feeling the ground through the soles of his boots, and when he spoke, his voice carried the caution of someone who had learned to count betrayals like footsteps. The bridge had once been guarded by living sentries, he said, but the Veil believed in old bargains and let its wards do the rest. If the wards still held, they would taste intent, and if they tasted bloodlust, they would turn the river into a mouth. They crossed single file, Cassian between them, the water beneath so dark Mara could not tell if it ran a foot deep or endlessly, and halfway across, she felt the balustrade vibrate as if it were a harp string plucked by an unseen hand, a note too low for ears that nevertheless hummed along her bones. Armand's head lifted, his eyes swept the upper shadows, and in that flicker of attention, the ambush sprang from the pillars like knives shaken out of velvet. Shadows unlatched themselves from stone, cloaks shedding dust, faces lamplit only where teeth and eyes reflected, and the bridge became a narrow coffin of bodies, closing from both ends. The first enforcer landed lightly on the rail in a crouch and smiled as if the waiting had been the worst of the work. He was elegant in a way that made Mara think of ballroom floors, the polite shine of cruelty when it is sure of applause. His voice suggested ritual and boredom all at once as he named Armand by his full style and broke the title like a stick across his knee, announcing that the Court of Ash had pronounced him unkinged in absentia, and that the child was not an heir, but a breach in the dam of law, and that breaches were to be sealed with stone and weeping. Mara would have laughed at the theatricality, if not for the way the river answered him. A little upward lick like a dog tasting the air before a bite. Armand did not waste syllables on outrage. He caught the enforcer's ankle and twisted so fast, the motion looked almost gentle, a correction in a dance, and the man went spinning into the dark, where the water closed without a ripple, as if the river preferred to eat without witnesses. The others moved in the way of professionals who know that surprise is a single-use gift, and for a moment, steel flashed and air burned, and time stretched thin, thinner, snapped, and stitched itself together around a different order of things. Mara had the boy in both arms and her back pressed to the cold rail, and she knew with an animal knowledge that if she watched Armand fight, she would stand like a spectator while death apprenticed itself to her indecision. So she did not watch. She kept her eyes on the way the locket's light reacted to threat, brightening in increments that corresponded to closeness and intent, a warning more honest than words. The bridge shook with bodies, and the pillars brightened with the sparks of strikes deflected. And then a new shape stepped out from the deeper dark, and the air around Mara went still because some betrayals arrived not like storms, but like old songs. Heard from another room, he was not cloaked. He wore the austere black of a commander with no need to advertise his authority, and his face was a study in beautiful restraint, the kind sculptors try to teach stone: nobility of line, economy of motion, the almost kindness with which a butcher can prepare a blade. Armand froze for the space between two heartbeats, and that pause was an intimacy the way silence can be with someone who knows what lives inside it. The name he spoke was not a title, but a memory. Ravel. Mara understood at once because it was in Armand's eyes, that precise compound of relief and dread that comes when a man you used to trust walks into your war carrying the enemy's password. Ravel bowed the exact degree owed to a king who is no longer one, and said he had sworn to safeguard the Night Court even from its own sovereign, that Armand had mistaken mercy for policy, that the world had no weather severe enough to scour away the stain of mixing mortal breath with immortal hunger. He asked for the boy very gently, like a physician who has practiced sympathy in mirrors. Cassian made a sound Mara had not heard from him, not a cry and not a word, but the concussed moan a child makes in dreams when falling into a well, and he pressed himself into her with a force that told her his body recognized this man before his mind found the name for what recognition must mean. Armand said Ravel's name again, and this time it was a verdict. But Ravel only smiled the way a priest might when a heretic quotes scripture, and he lifted his hand, and the enforcers fell back as neatly as drawers pushed closed by an invisible palm. He spoke of the veil as if of an illness, a pocket of contagion, and of the wards as if they could be politely asked to step aside for men who have memorized the first principles of violence. He explained that mercy breeds rebellions faster than blood ever has, and he added, with the courteous malice of a man delivering to an old friend the last kindness of plain speech, that Armand had always been soft where it mattered, that kings who love are kings who fall, and that he had learned this from watching the queen die under an order he had signed with a hand as steady as this one. Something broke in Armand's face, not the mask, because masks do not break so much as melt, revealing the flesh that was using them for weatherproofing. He moved with a speed Mara could not follow, and the bridge became a shorthand of motion. But Ravel had not come to win a duel. He had come with mathematics, with numbers lined up like a column of ciphers, and with one small advantage large enough to alter gravity. The advantage was knowledge of the bond. He named it in the air between them and smiled when Armand's blade hesitated, because hesitation is a lever, and levers move worlds. He explained, still gentle, that the mortal woman was now the fuse in the child's heart, and that flame is easier to snuff than a furnace, and that any father, even a false one, will tilt his neck to the knife if the knife is held to his child's throat first. The enforcers shifted as if choreographed by that sentence. The ring constricted, and one blade slid past Armand's guard like an eel discovering a hole in a net, and went for the smallest target. Mara saw its geometry and did not correct it with thought. The body has reflexes earned through a lifetime of placing other people's plates on tables without spilling, of learning where elbows will be before elbows decide. And she moved with that quiet expertise, turning her body into a thing that caught metal meant for the boy. The shock of impact was not heat, but pressure, the way deep water makes ears ache. The blade went in high at the ribs and did not meet bone for a moment that lasted 10 years. And when it did, the sound inside her was a dull chime that told her the world had just rung her like a bell. She did not drop the child. Her arms tightened on him with a grip that belonged to someone stronger, someone who did not care what tore so long as the held thing did not fall. The locket flared hard enough to bleach the world into negatives. The river flashed white like teeth. The pillars shook dust loose in slow drifts. And Mara felt an old word rise in her mouth that was not a prayer so much as a demand that the universe look at itself. Cassian's cry answered the blade with something older than lungs. His mouth opened on a sound that made the bridge resonate, and the air become a membrane pulled tight over the drum of the earth, and the light coming out of the locket became a wall, a dome, a cloche placed over a meal the gods had decided to keep for themselves. The blood ward manifested not as fire, but as memory hardened into law. It lifted enforcers off their feet and set them down against stone, with a courtesy that turned cruel only when they tried to rise. Ravel staggered, not because the ward flung him, but because it rejected him as if he were a word misspoken in a charm. His face altered at last. The certainty thinned. The superior quiet left his eyes. And behind it, Mara saw the boy Armand might once have called brother. The one who had learned loyalty like a language, and then been taught a dialect with fewer words for love. He looked at Mara with a speculative curiosity that felt obscene, given the iron taste filling her mouth, and he remarked, almost admiring, that the bond had set faster than the old scrolls predicted, that the human heart could sometimes outrun alchemy when the provocation was ordinary kindness, and that this was why policy must never allow exceptions. Armand was at the ward's edge now, his hands braced on nothing, his face a map of failures he refused to accept as permanent, and he called Mara's name with a gravity that made it sound like a country he was unwilling to lose again. Inside the ward, the world had the muffled acoustics of snowfall. Sound arrived softened. Light arrived with gentler edges, and the pain in Mara's side moved from a spear to a heavy hand pressing down, insisting she lie still and sneeze blood into her. Cupped palm in a parody of dainty manners, Cassian was on his knees, both hands spread on her ribs without touching. His eyes turned the exact silver of the locket's brightest flare, and he was speaking rapidly in a language she did not know, and yet understood the way a body understands the meaning of a lullaby sung in another tongue. He told the air to choose. He told the blood to remember its origin story. He told the ward to let the woman live because she had made a promise the world itself had already co-signed. And then he did something that should not have been possible for a child. He reached into the light and pulled out a thread that looked like smoke and tied it to her breath. The ward pulsed in answer, the dome expanding a hair, and every enforcer who had crept closer found his teeth shaking in his skull. Ravel called for a spear, not thrown, but sung, some old weapon that arrives when named with the right vowels, and a length of shadow hardened in his hand, the kind of tool an engineer of extinction might admire. He thrust it at the ward, and it slid across the surface with a hiss like meat on a pan, and came to rest, twitching, as though it had found something to eat, and discovered it tasted like oath. Armand struck from the other side in a blur, and the spear cracked. A hairline seam appeared, and where it did, the ward responded with a frequency too high for anything living to like. The bridge howled, the river boiled, the pillars wept, condensation cold as starlight, and Mara felt her consciousness tip toward a place where the edges of things blur into a merciful generality. She could have let go there. It would have been easy to float into the undifferentiated, and for a moment she wanted that ease more than she had ever wanted sleep or forgiveness. Then Cassian said her name not as a plea, but as a title, and it put a spine back into the fog. She made herself focus on his face, not on the warmth leaving her fingers, or the way her legs had become a rumor. She thought about the stupid knitted scarf, about the way he had clutched it with the seriousness of a small animal presented with a burrow. And she thought about her mother's pills and the rent and the 1,000-piece puzzle of an ordinary life she had believed was all she was allowed to want. And she realized these were not weight, but ballast. The ward flickered, because every act of protection costs fuel, and Cassian's small body was paying interest at a rate no child should owe. A tremor ran through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with expenditure. She remembered, through the red drift behind her eyes, that Armand had said the ward fed on a single kind of currency, and that the treasury that minted it was not magic, but choice. She did not love like a queen in a legend. She loved the way a waitress does, with hands and small, stubborn tasks, with making something hot and sweet for someone who is cold, with taking the late shift so a stranger can sleep. She pushed her palm over the blood on her ribs and pressed it to the locket so the skin-to-silver contact made a new conduction path. And she said out loud, because some contracts require articulation, that the boy was hers to protect until she could hand him back alive to a world worth living in. The dome brightened, not to more brilliance, but to a warmer one. The color shifted from sterile moon to a blush that suggested blood deciding to remain indoors. Outside, Ravel saw the change and mistook it for weakness, which is often how cruelty perceives tenderness, and he ordered the enforcers forward in a wedge meant to pry the ward open with weight. The wedge hit and slid and gained nothing, and Armand chose the moment to stop defending and begin hunting. He moved along the rail with a silence that made Mara think the word king meant not crowns, but the particular authority of absence. And when he arrived where Ravel stood, he brought with him something that had been waiting for language. The fight that followed was not elegant, because grief had been invited. And grief fights with the practicality of someone cleaning a wound with whiskey and a rag. Ravel matched him, skill for skill, and still lost ground, because Armand had stopped taking care of the bridge and started breaking pieces off it to use as arguments. The crack in the ward widened when one stone chunk struck, not because the ward failed, but because it made a decision. And Mara understood dimly that the ward wanted to choose not just what to keep out, but what to let in. Armand stepped through the seam with his arms bare to the light, and the skin there smoked, not with burning, but with the news of contact between contradictory sovereignties. He knelt, and the look on his face was a man who has been allowed to enter a church after years of exile. He put his hands over Cassian's small ones, without displacing them, and spoke in the low, exact tone of a father instructing his son in a craft, meant to save more than one life. He taught the boy how to borrow without theft, how to ask the ward for strength without demanding it, how to thread his power through the woman without tangling it in her human laws. The light responded by becoming less visible and more present, and Mara felt the pressure on her ribs ease by degrees, small enough to trust. She did not notice when her breath stopped skipping and started behaving. Ravel saw his window closing and abandoned caution for spectacle. He leapt onto the balustrade and called the river by an old name it was supposed to have forgotten. The one that makes water, remember it loves drowning. And for a trembling instant, Mara thought the whole bridge would go under, and all of this would resolve into that simple outcome. But the river had been listening to other promises tonight, And instead of rising to Ravel's song, it turned on him with an affectionate cruelty, lifting in a smooth swell that unfooted him like a rug pulled by a practiced prankster, and he fell not into the water, but toward the ward. Armand caught him by the wrist in a grip clinical enough to be dissection, and said in a voice without fury that betrayal is not a philosophy, but a habit, then broke the habit at the joint. Ravel screamed in a register that scraped ice off the pillars, and the enforcers wavered, because leadership, when it bleeds, exposes the arithmetic of loyalty. It did not end in triumph. It ended the way wars usually end, with a retreat measured not in honor regained, but in breaths available. Ravel spat a promise that the Court of Ash would salt the veil until nothing grew that could love, and he faded with the others into the splice of dark between pillars, where the rules favored those who had memorized them. Armand did not give chase because he had a living thing to attend, and because victory here would be counted in what did not die. The ward softened at the edge like a soap bubble deciding not to burst, and Armand leaned in and picked Mara up the way men pick up things they cannot bear to see on the ground. She expected distance in his hands and found reverence. He held her as if she were not simply the child's anchor, but the hinge upon which his ruined kingdom might yet swing. The blade slid wetly from her side, and he sealed the wound with a heat she did not want to think could come from hands that had killed, and the pain flared, and then withdrew like a tide that had lost interest in her shoreline. Cassian pressed his face into her neck and said nothing, which said everything. They crossed the rest of the bridge under a ceiling of quiet. The river went on, pretending it had never swallowed anything. The pillars resumed their patient project of becoming more beautiful by erosion. The ward diminished, but did not vanish. It hovered like a patient guardian unwilling to admit fatigue, and the locket's glow settled into a slower rhythm, one that matched Mara's newly disciplined breath. Armand spoke only once, and when he did, the words were apology wrapped in decree. He said he had failed to keep the boy safe without making a weapon of him, and that he would not repeat the failure now that the world had seen the bond choose a shape. He said they would reach the veil by the next turn of the earth, if the passages remembered compassion, and that the court, having tasted the edge of the ward, would not come again with probes, but with armies, and that armies are stupid in ways that can be. They moved into a lower corridor where roots dangled from the ceiling like the hair of giants sleeping under the floor of the world, and the air smelled of old rain and crushed leaves, so alive it made Mara's eyes sting. She thought dimly, as the ache in her side traded sharpness for an exhausted throb, about how easily her life had shifted from concerns she could list on a napkin to calculations that involved the tensile strength of love. She did not feel brave. She felt employed by something that had decided she was competent. The boy slept at last, hand in her hair, and Armand watched them both the way men watch fires that must not go out. Behind them, somewhere in the architecture of the mountain, Ravel was reorganizing his disappointment into strategy, and the Court of Ash was folding its outrage into banners. Ahead, the Vale waited with its silver trees and its old laws, and between those two arrows on the map stood a human woman, bleeding just enough to remind herself she was alive and too stubborn to step aside, while an ancient world decided it preferred its myths without mercy. When the tunnel breathed a warmer draft across her face, she knew they were passing under a seam in the rock where the outside world exhaled into the underways. And in that gentle moving air, she heard, impossible as weather inside stone, a bell. It had no source she could name. It sounded like a village calling its people to witness, and like a court convening, and like a mother's spoon on a pot. Cassian stirred and smiled in his sleep, the line between his brows smoothing as if some net had been lifted from his dreams. Armand closed his eyes, only for an instant, and the expression there suggested he was praying to something that does not take praise, but accepts responsibility. The worst had not passed. The war had not decided who it belonged to. The wound had not yet finished, teaching her what it planned to mean. But the sacrifice had set a gear in motion that could not be unmeshed, and the betrayal had named itself so clearly that even the timid parts of the world would have to pick a side. In the end, she had not died, and the boy had not been taken, and the king who called himself Monster had been forced by love to behave like a sovereign. And somewhere very far above the mountain, the dawn rehearsed its entrance with the patience of a stagehand who knows the show cannot go on without light. They reached the vale at dusk that never quite decided to end, a bowl of land cupped in the mountain's hands, where silver-barked trees lifted leaves as thin as coins, and the air carried a sweetness that did not belong to stone. And for a few heartbeats, Mara believed they had outrun the arithmetic of pursuit, because the old laws lay over everything like clear glass, and the roots hummed with the satisfaction of a promise kept. Yet even as that relief rose, it broke against the sight of the court already there, ranks of the high bloods arranged along the amphitheater of terraced earth in garments black enough to drink the last color out of the world, banners of ash twisting with no wind to move them, and at the center of the open circle, a chair of pale wood waited like an accusation, and Mara understood that Ravel had not failed so much as chosen the place for the ending, for the veil would magnify whichever law spoke loudest in its soil, and the court of ash had arrived early to teach it what to remember. Armand did not slow. He walked down into the bowl with a stillness that made the nobles lean forward without meaning to, because hatred delights in confidence, so it can feed on its collapse. And when he reached the lowest step, he stood with his hands empty and his back unarmed, and addressed them not as subjects, but as jurors, reminding them of the oath that founded their dominion, the one that borrowed its teeth from mortal consent and its heart from restraint. And he said that the child they hunted was not a stain, but the artifact of a love that declared their fear a small god, and that small gods must never be allowed to run empires. Ravel stepped from the tier of judges with his arm bound in a sling that looked grown rather than sewn, and with a smile calibrated to look weary rather than triumphant. And he announced that the court had no interest in the boy as a person, only as a symptom, and symptoms must be treated before the disease spreads, and that this treatment would be mercifully quick if Armand yielded and allowed the old sentence to complete itself. For mercy is a blade with a clean edge when wielded by men who have rehearsed compassion until it sounds like policy. The murmur that followed felt like rain deciding whether to fall. The silver trees chimed a little, metal leaves kissing each other, and the veil considered which voice to amplify. Cassian's locket answered for it, a single quiet pulse that made the terraces glow along their carved seams. And in that light, Mara felt the wound at her side pull tight, as if stitched by delicate, invisible hands, the ache resolving into a scar that belonged to her as thoroughly as her name, and she realized that the veil listened not with ears, but with appetite, hungry for any story that made the old treaty feel less like parchment and more like breath. And before she could think herself out of it, she stepped forward and told them what it tastes like to wrap your only good scarf around a child who feels like stone. How fear is a noisy animal that can be outrun if you leave it on the leash of tasks. How kindness is not a halo but a habit. And she spoke in the clumsy grammar of a woman who has carried too many plates and apologized too often for existing. And the words shook a little, but did not break, because truth is heavy enough to steady itself. And when she finished, there was a Silence that did not belong to intimidation, but to listening. And into that listening, Ravel poured poison with the precision of an apothecary who knows the dose, asking whether they would let a human dictate the architecture of immortal law, whether pity would become the hinge on which their throne swung open to the mob, whether a kingdom could afford to make exceptions for stories that felt like songs. And he lifted his sling with stage-managed sadness and reminded them of the price paid when. Kings prefer love to order. The circle tightened. Guards moved with the mechanical grace of instruments. A ring of crimson-tipped spears descended like the petals of a carnivorous flower. And Armand's stillness sharpened into the geometry of imminent violence. But before steel could complete its argument, the earth itself intervened with a sound like the lowest string of a cello pulled past endurance, and roots erupted through the loam in braided cords, not to bind the guards, but to mark a boundary on the ground, a circle around Mara and the boy and Armand that glowed with the same silver as the trees, and the oldest of the nobles, the ones who remembered when the first treaty was signed under these branches, rose without being asked because the veil had called. Witnesses who had not yet made room in their bones for forgetting. The speech that followed belonged to no single throat. It moved from elder to elder, like a candle passed hand to hand, a memory of the night when immortals, desperate for legitimacy, had sworn to honor any mortal who sheltered them at cost to themselves. And they recited the clause that had fallen out of fashion, but not out of magic, the one that promised sanctuary and title and blood debt repaid not to nobility or priesthood, but to an act, a simple act of provision where fear says no, and the hand says yes. And as the words circled the bowl, the roots brightened, and the air grew warm enough that Mara forgot to shiver, and the court of ash, for all its banners, had to watch law return to its oldest mouth. Ravel did not flinch. He simply moved to the last lever he owned, and he pulled it with the elegance of a man who has never known anything but leverage, for the spears changed angle not toward Armand, but toward the woman he would not let them threaten, and the archers took their measure not from the boy, but from the living fuse that had made the ward wake. And in that instantaneous reconfiguration of cruelty, Armand understood that the calculus refused to admit of bravery that saves only itself, and he turned so that his body became a wall that would not fall, and said the one sentence he had not allowed himself to say since the Queen died, speaking it in the voice of a vow rather than a plea. "Take me and let them go." It almost worked. The old ones inclined their heads because sacrifice is a language they still respect, and the veil hummed with the surprise of a predator discovering it has been offered meat it did not ask for, but the court of ash did not come to. Be moved by courage, it came to annihilate precedent, and Ravel, with that same tired smile, gave a small signal that meant kill the story at its source, and a shaft of night left a bow with a whisper too soft to be warning, and flew in a line so perfect. It might have been a thought, and Mara watched it travel the way one watches a glass fall, all the time in the world contained in an inch, and she knew where it would land, because her body had been learning this choreography since the first cup she carried as a girl sloshed hot tea onto her wrist, and she moved into its path, not because heroism had rented her flesh, but because she had already discovered. There are moments when not moving would empty you of the person you understand yourself to be. The impact stole language. It turned her into a candle whose flame leaned sideways, and for a heartbeat, everything narrowed to the sound of Cassian saying her name, with the terror of someone who has just discovered the geometry that keeps a universe together can be unthreaded by a sharp object. And then, before the veil could decide whether to pronounce sentence on a world that wastes women like this, Armand committed the one crime every statute agrees to condemn and every miracle quietly requires. He took his wrist to his mouth and broke his own skin and pressed the impossible to Mara's lips. The blood was not a liquid so much as a season. It tasted of pomegranate and iron, and winter sun, and old griefs boiled down to something sweet enough to keep. And it entered her like a second breath that had been waiting for permission. And at once. The amphitheater became a courtroom and a cathedral and a nursery, because three laws spoke together and all refused to yield. The Queen's last decree, buried in the locket's silver, waking under the heat of her blood and naming Mara as cradle-bearer in arm. The old tongue that makes titles into tasks, the veil's covenant flaring to full brightness and conferring sanctuary and standing on any mortal who bled for immortal life without demand for reward, and the Night Court's secret interdiction against sharing royal blood with the unmade catching fire and burning away not Armand's authority, but the chains welded to it. For the forbidden act, done in the sight of all, did not damn him so much as force every witness to pick which law they wanted to live under. The world tilted. Sky and leaves wove together. The arrow slid out of Mara as if disdainful of how little it had accomplished, and her lungs drew a breath that did not claw at the air, and her eyes, which had been ordinary all her life, saw with a sudden terrible gentleness that the silver worked into the locket matched a line hidden for generations in the cheap wool scarf her mother had knitted, that the lullaby she had hummed without words was a harvest song from the first winter of peace, that her grandmother had told the story as a superstition because it was safer that way, and the recognition was not a coronation because nothing gold touched her head. But the trees bent their branches toward her, and the ground eased to meet her. Feet and Cassian, sobbing with relief, laid his small palm flat over her heart and whispered that the world had finally remembered the name it tried not to say. Ravel shouted something about contagion, but his voice broke on the leaves and fell, and the elders, all at once, and without instruction, knelt the old way, not to Armand, but to the function that makes a kingdom tolerable. And Armand, who had thought himself emptied of tears centuries ago, let one fall and did not shame himself for it, then turned, and because spectacle is sometimes a mercy when it is married to truth, he spoke his decree so that even the bats in the high caves would carry it out, into the fields, announcing that henceforth any human who gave aid to vampire kind in good faith would be placed under the protection of the crown and given the rights of guest law regardless of station, and that any immortal who harmed such a person would answer with blood and name and title in the court of ash or in the dirt if the court proved cowardly, and that the child, Cassian Vile, recognized by the veil and by the silver trees and by the old covenant that predates thrones, would be raised under the wardship of the cradle-bearer until he chose his path, and that the cradle-bearer, Mara Hensley of Hollow Pines, would be honored not for her usefulness to a prophecy, but for the habitual courage of her hands. It did not end in silence. It ended in sound made by living things aloud, finally, to sound like themselves. The trees chimed in arpeggios of leaf and wind. The old ones spoke blessings in accents that had not been heard aloud in 200 years. The ground exhaled, and the ranks of the court fractured along a line that had always been there, but had lacked a blade to reveal it, because some rose furious and left not to regroup, but to sulk in ruins, and others, more than Armand dared. Hope stepped forward awkwardly, like men apologizing without yet knowing the right words, and offered their fealty not to his crown, but to the smallest law that had righted the largest wrong. Mara stood in the middle of it, breathing through the last of the shock, Armand's hand steady at her back and Cassian's fingers entwined with hers, and she realized that the forbidden act had not made her monstrous, but had given her a way to live in, a world whose rules she could not accept if they remained untouched. And when she lifted her head to meet the stare of what remained of the Court of Ash, she did not see enemies so much as people, deciding how much of their fear they were willing to keep. And she did not flinch, because the ward inside her heart had learned a tone that did not waver, and its music filled the bowl with the simplest revelation of all. That love, declared in public and backed with law, is not a rumor, but a regime. When dawn finally came to the Vale, it did not break like an ordinary sunrise. It seeped through the silver trees, as if poured from within. Light without direction, rising from the ground itself instead of falling from the sky. The air was warmer than it had been in centuries, carrying the scent of moss and thawed earth. The mountain, once a husk of stone, breathed again. Where the Court of Ash had stood, only dust remained, drifting upward in thin, glittering veils that joined the brightness above. The banners that had once marked dominion lay dissolving into the soil, feeding the roots that would remember their color as nothing more than an old scar. In that silence, between the retreat of shadows and the first murmurs of morning, the world began to reassemble itself from the language of fear into something new. Mara felt it through her feet, through the pulse that beat beneath her skin in quiet rhythm with the boys. The wound in her side had sealed into a faint silver mark, a thread of light that pulsed gently whenever Cassian laughed or sighed in his sleep. She stood on the terrace overlooking the valley and watched the mist roll out like a tide drawing back from a beach, revealing green beneath gray. Armand stood a little distance away, his figure still and dark against the rising light. He had removed his cloak and crown, both objects resting at the base of one of the trees whose roots had saved them. The crown no longer shone with the red fire of power. Its jewels had dulled to amber, their color now soft and warm, and for the first time, the symbol of the Night Court looked almost human. He said nothing, but Mara could feel the gravity of his thoughts. He was looking not at victory, but at the remains of an empire built from the bones of his own mistakes. He had won a world, but lost the definition that had made him its ruler. And yet there was no bitterness in the line of his mouth, only a weary acceptance, the stillness of a man who has outlived both his own legend and the necessity of pretending to deserve it. Cassian ran across the terrace barefoot, the locket bouncing against his chest, and the trees bent their branches toward him as he passed. The child's laughter carried through the Vale like something foreign, soft, unashamed, ordinary, and that sound alone made the silver bark blush faintly gold. The boy stopped at Mara's side and tugged her sleeve. "It smells different," he said, wrinkling his nose. "Like rain before it starts." She smiled, brushing his hair from his face. "That's what peace smells like," she answered, though her voice trembled slightly at the truth of it. He tilted his head, considering. "Is it going to stay?" She wanted to promise him yes, but promises, she had learned, were heavier than oaths when spoken to children who believe them. "If we take care of it," she said instead. "Peace is like a plant. It grows if you don't forget to water it." He nodded solemnly, and something in his gaze, an awareness too deep for his age, made her wonder how long it would be before he began to remember everything that had happened. Armand approached then, silent as the wind shifting through the branches. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and reverence, though when he spoke it was with the hesitancy of a man unused to asking permission. "The council has scattered," he said quietly. "Those who remain will need a ruler, But I am not the one they will follow now. They saw what you did. They saw what he became because of you." Mara shook her head. "I didn't turn the world. It was already ready to move." Armand smiled faintly. "Even the moon needs gravity to pull it." He paused, then looked toward the boy. "He will grow into something neither of our kinds can fully understand. The blood inside him is both hunger and mercy. He will need a guide who remembers both sides of the wound." His words held no expectation, but the weight of them settled in her chest, like a secret she had already been keeping. "You mean me," she said. "You are the bridge," he replied simply. They walked together through the vale's heart, where the silver trees grew closest, their trunks forming an open cathedral. In the clearing stood the river that had once guarded the entrance, now calm and clear, reflecting the sky like polished glass. The water no longer tasted of blood. Its surface shimmered with light, too pure to belong to either day or night. Armand stepped to its edge, scooped a handful into his palm, and let it spill between his fingers. "It's alive again," he said. "The curse is broken. The old hunger is quiet." Mara knelt beside him, tracing a finger along the surface. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we begin remembering how to live without fear." When they returned to the terraces, some of the surviving vampires had already begun their quiet work. They dismantled the black banners, buried the broken weapons, and tended to the wounded without distinction between mortal and immortal. Mara watched a young soldier lift a human girl onto a stretcher, his hands careful, his fangs hidden behind a shy smile. And she understood that something irreversible had shifted. No decree could have forced such gentleness. It had come from exhaustion, from the long, collective fatigue of creatures who had finally run out of reasons to hate. The air itself seemed to approve. Birds that had not been seen in the valley for centuries circled above, hesitant at first, then settling among the branches like returning tenants. As the light deepened toward evening, the silver trees began to glow again, not with the cold luminescence of old magic, but with the soft warmth of fireflies. The vale pulsed, as though breathing, its rhythm matching the steady heartbeat Mara now shared with the boy. Armand turned to her once more, his eyes no longer the molten red of rage, but the dark amber of autumn leaves. "The council will not dare rise against this," he said. "But there will always be those who prefer chains to choice. If they return, they will come for you first." Mara looked out over the valley, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "Let them come," she said. "I'm done being afraid of what's different." Cassian took her hand, and for a moment, she felt the faint echo of the locket's pulse through his skin. The mark at her side glowed in answer, silver threading through her veins like moonlight caught beneath glass. The three of them stood there together, the king without a throne, the woman remade by mercy, and the child born from both shadow and dawn, watching the world exhale. Somewhere high above the mountain, the sun broke through the mist, and the first real daylight in centuries spilled across the vale, striking the river until it became a mirror of fire. Armand lifted his face toward it and closed his eyes, and when the light touched him, it did not burn. It only made him visible. Mara knew then that they had not simply survived a war. They had rewritten the weather of an entire species. She thought of the diner with its cracked linoleum and the hum of its neon sign, of her mother's pills on the counter, of the small, tired world she had once thought would end with her. That life felt distant now, not lost, but integrated, like the first chapter of a book whose ending had been waiting far beyond her comprehension. She was not divine, not chosen, not saint or savior. She was just Someone who had refused to look away from a crying child in the fog. And somehow, that had been enough to change everything. The Vale's bells began to ring then, a low, resonant sound carried by the wind through the forest and over the mountains. It was neither funeral nor coronation, but something gentler, a sound of release. The river shimmered brighter, and the leaves above caught the light and scattered it like slow rain. Armand turned toward her once more, his expression unguarded, his voice almost tender. "The world will remember your name," he said. Mara smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Let it remember his instead." She looked down at Cassian, who was watching the sunrise with eyes reflecting both her humanity and his father's immortality. "He's the one who's going to build what comes next." Armand inclined his head. "Then it will be a kingdom worthy of mercy." As the sun climbed higher, the shadows retreated, and the silver trees grew luminous with light instead of moonfire. The curse that had bound the night court to darkness had lifted completely, replaced by something quieter and infinitely stronger. It was not redemption carved into marble or sung in temples. It was simple endurance, love surviving its own impossibility, and when Mara took Cassian's hand and stepped into the light, she felt no fear, no hesitation, only the weightless certainty that Dawn had remembered their names and chosen, finally, to stay.